Hello, I'm here with Stephanie J. Williams, the director of Hospes, which is playing at the third annual Academy of Death Racers Festival. And if you're seeing this, that festival should have started. So hopefully you've been enjoying lots of great films, and hopefully you've enjoyed Hospes. I hope you've had the chance to see it. First, I want to just say thank you so much for submitting your film and for making this film, Stephanie. This was, as soon as I watched it, I'm one of the programmers, I'm not one of the juries this year, so I can say that I think it's one of the best films that we have at the festival.
Oh.
It's certainly by a mile the best one that I've seen.
Oh.
And as soon as I saw it, I knew that we had to have this at our festival, and I was a big champion of it within the programming committee. So I'm very happy that we're able to show it. And thank you again for submitting this.
Oh, thank you for all of those kind things. Yeah.
The first thing that I wanted to ask about is sort of related to the title. The title, Hospes, is the Greek word that means guest or host. It is the root word for hospitality in English. And I think especially after I had read that statement and then watched the short with that in mind, the thing that stood out to me most is the presence of doors in this film. The entire film takes place in an area surrounded by doors, and those doors there's a variety of them. They often switch like designs. They're opening and closing, but I did also notice that I don't think there's a direct on-screen time when anything actually passes through one of those doors. So there's a lot of thoughts in there, but I mostly just wanted to ask about doors in this movie.
Okay, sure. Well, the original idea for the film came out of kind of code switching. That's it's not solely about that. Actually, when the project first came about, it was supposed to be really funny. It's not terribly funny anymore. In the course of the work, but it comes from a lens of being somebody who's been deemed racially ambiguous, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I quote unquote pass for a lot of things. And I think that I think that's a really human response when we come encounter with something that we don't know or how to categorize. There's this game of like, okay, well, how do I place you? Because that provides context for how we're supposed to proceed. Mm-hmm. So that's a really intangible space, but it's one that I find really interesting and something that I address in a lot of my work. So when I was thinking about some kind of conflict, I was like, well, the conflict isn't something that I could put my hand on immediately. It's something that it's really important that it be intangible, that the thing that I'm most anxious about is the thing that hasn't happened yet or could possibly happen. So when I was thinking about making visible this kind of conflict, I was like, okay, well, there are these passageways, there are these communication passageways that I have encountered, but I'm not quite sure what's on the other end of it. And so that intangibility, but that precarious nature of that exchange is something that is represented through the doors and the promise of something behind it and not knowing what's on the other side.
Mm-hmm. But what I found, it's funny you were saying that it's supposed to be funny, or at least originally was, because I found the very last shot of this film actually like kind of heartbreaking. The very last shot is the first time that we get an on-screen interaction with one of those doors, like explicitly, and it's a door shutting to one of the puppets, which I think is it's really sad.
Yeah. Coming up with like a traditional narrative is not something that I really know how to do. I come from like a fine arts background, and I'm actually much better at like the questions surrounding a conversation. And so when I was thinking about like, okay, well, finally we're going to be able to have this like reveal. I was like, well, no, I mean, the point is not about a reveal or an answer. It's really much about this exchange, this human need to identify things and not being able to. So it seemed more appropriate to close off an answer and focus the story more on that exchange of questioning rather than provide this big reveal space where all the questions are answered. I know that when I am in the space of being asked, what are you? Like you pass for this, this, and this in terms of my ethnicity, in terms of my race, sexuality, etc. It's not really of interest to me to provide an answer. And, like I recognize that the film isn't necessarily one that would provide the lens that I'm interested in specifically, but that questioning space of not understanding true context, I think is a really human response. And it's something that I wanted to delve into a little bit deeper.
I'm stuck a bit on the end as, the idea that you put forward, not that necessarily is in the film, but that idea of a reveal at the end. Because I would agree that the end isn't really a reveal, but if I'm thinking about this as a, for lack of a better term, a narrative, even though I don't think that fully applies, the end is very much like a punctuation of everything that's come before. Not necessarily so much as a reveal, but more of like when that door closes, that's the end. There's nothing afterwards.
Yeah. Well, it's also the first place where you as the audience are looking at the scene, and then you're seeing the perspective of the puppet. Everything up until that point is from like a safe distance. So I thought that it might be a really lovely place to put the audience in a place that seemed a little bit more tangible. You're in that space. You are in that confrontation as well. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't quite resolved all of it beyond that. I just I wanted to bring the audience in a bit.
And specifically, you're trying to bring the audience into that puppet, and the puppet was also fascinating to me. Not just the one; there's several puppets. But I noticed. What did I write down? I was pretty proud of what I wrote down earlier. Most the characters in this film, as much as you could call them characters, are fully ambiguous, like pieces of meat, which we'll come back to shortly.
Think about meat,
but they're not even really identifiable by species, let alone race or gender or anything. They are as ambiguous as you could possibly get with those characters. And I thought that that's a really interesting space to put the audience into, because I guess in a way anyone could relate to those characters, but also no one really can. There's sort of relatable and not at the same time.
Yeah. I am. Well, so the original idea, the funny idea that's not funny anymore. So like in my family, like everyone's super mixed, and we get when we have like family get-togethers, we compare like these "what are you" stories. So like if me and my sibling and my cousins were walking down the street, we would not look like we were related to one another. And so when we get together, the exchange is like, oh my gosh, I had this interaction, it was hilarious. With this guessing game, this awkwardness of guessing game, started to partake. And so I was like, okay, well, that's funny, that's interesting. And I'm like, well, the reason why it's so funny is because we're like judging literal meat, which is such a corny and very literal idea. You're judging literal meat for context. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so human. And specifically, it's so American. Like I'm from DC. One of the first things, and the first, like when you first meet people, a very common question is, well, what do you do for a living? So if I know what you do for a living, that will inform the rest of our conversation, how I treat you. And that's a very American thing. It's a very DC thing. So I was like, okay, well, that's in itself a very funny, literal thing to judge this like literal meat. So a lot of my work deals with the literalness of judging meat and its pieces. So the pieces, like in and apart from each other, they don't quite make a whole lot of sense. Like maybe you could see like an orifice or protuberance there and be like, okay, that's a body part that I can recognize. But the rest of it, that tucks it all together, not so much. So apart from one another, they don't make sense, but in the context of one another, they totally make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my sculpture, a lot of my aesthetic plays around with these things that they look like they're clipped pieces of things that are kind of recognizable, but you can't fully gauge the context. The not knowing is a part of it. It's part of the enjoyment.
Yeah, when I said they're not, the puppets aren't identifiable even by species. There's one or two where I'm like, that could be an elephant, actually.
Yeah. I did look at elephant tusks, by the way, just for the movement of it, just to get some motion tests. But yes.
So I liked the idea. We keep using the word meat, and literal meat, and just talking about meat. But I looked at a lot of your past work in preparation for this interview, and in your previous work, you've often explored identity specifically through food, and that actually, I guess I'm not surprised, but that did come as a bit of a surprise to me after watching this short, because where this short, I wouldn't have gone straight to that food place. Another short of yours, which I believe was, I forget the full name of it, Pinoy.
Oh, Pinoy Ploy. Yeah.
Pinoy Ploy, yes. That one is very explicitly, the food metaphor is made very explicit in that one.
Yeah.
And so I kind of wanted to ask about, when you were creating Hospice, do you feel this is sort of an extension of those same similar themes, or is this a bit of a departure, or is it maybe a bit reductive to reduce everything to food in the first place?
The Hospice is not about food, but my idea is about food being like a really direct map of culture. Like if I'm going to a new place and I know nothing about that new place, that new culture, my shortest pathway to understanding that culture is through food. Mm-hmm. Right? It's something I literally take inside my body. It's something that I can I haven't associated with stereotype yet, right? Because it's like a physical response. I'm eating, either I enjoy it, I don't enjoy it, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
So this piece isn't about food, it's more about taste and where that comes from. So my conversations about food led into a very direct conversation of understanding where my taste did or didn't come from. Like I grew up in the United States and went to my American history class, US history class. And there were a lot of things that I was taught in my American history class that were not in parallel with the history that I grew up with in my family. So my mother's side of the family is from the Philippines. My grandfather fought in World War II under the United States Army at the time, because the Philippines was a US colony for 50 years. And me not seeing the presence of his experience as a colonized nation in my history class is evidence of, okay, that's a literal omission. Mm-hmm. And so up until that point, understanding my family's experience in the context of the larger colonialized United States and the absence of things that I knew to be true, I'm like, okay, well, that I always thought when I grew up, my tastes are my own. Nothing else reflects that. But really, I'm in this mix just as anybody else is. There are a lot of things I don't know about my own culture, about my own upbringing, and that all informs where my tastes come from. So, like, if I see something that I have like an aversion to, well, where does that come from? It comes from my upbringing. My taste is not my own. My taste comes from how I was raised.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So when I'm thinking about Hospice, I know, long answers. When I was thinking about Hospice, I'm like, okay, well, I am this thing that is unidentifiable. I don't have a context that somebody can so easily associate with. So the context doesn't exist for how they treat me. If someone can say, oh, okay, well, I can then identify you as half Black and half Filipino. Okay, maybe that is a context to where I could move forward. But if I don't provide that context, it's a glitch in the system. It prevents it prevents like any kind of like external conversation from pushing forward. The stereotype isn't there yet. And so I just thought that was an interesting place to be. And I made a film about it, especially during COVID. It was a COVID film.
And actually not having that context is not providing that context is a really interesting theme of the movie, because I find that, the fact, especially that last scene, but the fact that those doors are opening and closing and nothing is going through almost implies a certain context, regardless of what the meat creatures are or are not identifiable as.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I just again, I'm interested in that space where the questioning happens.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really make any sense to go into it and say, well, okay, well now that at the end of the story we're going to go in and we're going to identify all these like meaty bits as these things. I mean, the puppets are kind of like not exactly, but I was thinking about when I was building them, I was thinking about like a school of fish. They could act individually, but they are very much a flock.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they work in Congress with one another.
And speaking about building the puppets, I was curious what they're made of.
Trash.
Nice.
Trash. I mean, I make a lot of sculptures and I'm very cheap.
Mm-hmm.
So I make these very large sculptures and I have a tendency not to throw things away. And when I sweep up my studio and there's like a little pile on the floor, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's some really beautiful aesthetic combinations there. So I try to reuse everything. So for the most part, they're made out of foam, latex, because it degrades over time. So it's really lovely to tear and through stop motion, and you can capture images more individually that way. But yeah, egg crate cartons, just scraps of fabric, like what's it called? Medium density upholstery foam that I use to stuff things, just kind of stuff that's kicking around.
All right.
Wood dowels, things like that. Yeah.
Nice. Switching gears a little bit, I wanted to talk about sound in this film. So the soundscape of this film really adds to the atmosphere. And what I really felt when I was watching this is that it always feels like it's building to something, and the thing it's building up to never quite comes. So I guess I wanted to, it's a bit similar it reminded me a bit actually of Pinoy Ploy again, where Pinoy Ploy has this hum going through the whole thing. And the sound in Hospice is, I would describe it as more composed, in that it is clearly something being deliberately played, but it is ambient in the same way. And so I kind of wanted to talk about what the process of doing the sound for this film was like. I know you did not do it all alone as well. I wanted to talk about your collaboration with Andrew Paul. Hopefully I'm pronouncing this right. Kuiper.
Kuiper. Yeah.
Kuiper. Okay. Yeah, I just sort of wanted to ask if you can speak on that a bit.
Sure. I am highly intimidated by sound, knowing that it affects so much of what you see. And so Andrew and I work together at Maryland Institute College of Art. We teach in the animation program together, and he teaches a lot of the animation for sound classes. Mm-hmm. And so I had this idea about making this film, and I asked him if he ever wanted to collaborate, and he was like, yeah, sure, I'd love that. And we were just talking about how sound is spatial, and I had a lot of conversations with him about how sound, a lot of what you hear, a lot of the sounds that you hear are actually felt with your body, it's chest down. So I was doing some research and I found out that elephants hear with their feet.
Huh.
They do. They
have such big ears, though.
They have this big, yeah, but they sense a lot with the ground, right? Mm-hmm. They can feel vibrations. A lot of the things that we don't actually physically perceive, we feel with our bodies.
Mhm.
I just thought that was so interesting. Since I'm talking about a lot of these conflicts that are intangible, that I can sense but I can't really touch. Sound was like a huge part of that. Like, how do you design a landscape that's not particular, that's internal, that's subterranean and intangible? And so Andrew we had a lot of conversations about space and where these puppets came from. Have they always lived in the space? Like, what kind of space are we in? Is there an echo? And he came up with this. I can't remember how many tracks there are in his, how many soundtracks are. I think it's like something obscene, like 150, 175 tracks, all mixed together. But he's really interested in percussion, the history of percussion, out of military, coming out of drone and filtering into drone. And so this project offered him a lot to play with. And he was like, well, what sorts of things can I hide in the layers? Sometimes there's an applause. Whenever a door opens, there's like an applause or an audience on the other end. There are a lot of things kind of hidden in there that, are suggestive, but they're not like right up in front in your face. And so like up until working with him, when I would approach sound, I would be like really upfront and loud about it. And I really appreciated the amount of subtlety and nuance he was able to provide. It really provided so much of the visuals, because if he was sending me sounds, I would listen to the sounds on repeat while I was animating, and then we'd have another conversation, and then it would go on like that for like, I guess, a year.
Yeah, a lot of the imagery in this does very directly and visibly deal with vibration. Like, I'm thinking of one scene where there's a hand that's slowly sort of torn apart, and the whole thing, so, like, the skin sort of flies away, and that has a very percussive sound right behind it that I guess has technically been there already, but it sort of takes on a little bit of a new meaning when you have that added visual to it.
Yeah. I mean, he would introduce so many different textures, but again, like it's really gradual. And again, I was not the driving force in the sound, so I'm not sure when some of those textures enter into that space. But yeah, I love the feeling like that you perceive of okay, there's a sound that enters in and now I'm paying attention to it, but maybe it's been there the entire time.
Yeah.
A lot of his sound pieces have an appreciation of that aesthetic. It's kind of like, okay, I'm in this soup. And maybe every once in a while I can recognize a texture here or there, but like to discern the individual pieces is quite difficult.
I definitely hadn't noticed the applause on the other end of the doors. So the next time I watch this, which will probably be right after this interview, I'll be looking for that.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
So the AoDR is an online-only festival. However, Hospes has played some in-person film festivals, including most notably of the ones I could find, the New Orleans Film Festival, where it won the Helen Hill Award for animated short. It won the jury award there in 2022. So how was it to watch this short with an audience?
Oh my gosh, I was so nervous. I was so nervous. It was me, actually everybody but Andrew was able to come. So Glenn, who did the rig fabrication, and Jeffrey Chance, who did the color, joined me in New Orleans, and we were watching it. And like, I think there was like an openness, but also a confusion in the crowd, which was actually, it was kind of nice, right? People are like, I don't really know what I'm watching, but I'm still watching. I'm like, okay, well, that's good. And then when they did the awards, I think like just before the screening, and I heard the description, and I would turn to my partner and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to meet this person. We have so much in common. And then they announced that we had won, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was crying. I was so excited. I'm like, this weird, very, very strange film this very strange movie actually got people's attention, and I don't know, it feels so great. Yeah, it feels so great.
Yeah, it's a very visceral and not immediately approachable movie. So yeah. I'm always happy when something like this wins awards, but it's one it's hard to recommend to your friends because it's hard to describe.
It's hard to describe. Yeah. It's its own problem, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to be clear about, which is kind of like the whole point. But but yeah, no, I felt really at home in New Orleans. People, I would say that the having conversations with people, like I'd never really been to film festivals before this past year. And I was just so like delighted to know that people really want to have a conversation about the work. Like people were asking really smart questions about the pieces, and I was like, okay, this is like adding so much to my original ideas about it. People are seeing things that I didn't even realize were there. So,
yeah. I think that well, especially the right crowds, experimental film can really, it can just show us things that we might kind of think about, but not really be able to engage with otherwise. Like there's so much in this film that is worth talking about and needs to be said, but is really hard to approach in a concrete way.
Yeah. It's how I know how to. But I agree with you. Yeah, it's my parents, lovely people were like, so I showed this to them and they're like, you know what people really like, they're like, this obviously took a long time, and like kudos for you for like for the labor, but you know, people really love Jesus and fruit. And people know what Jesus and fruit are, so you should look into that. And I was like, I will look into that, and they're not wrong. People do love Jesus and people do love fruit.
I would be very interested to see you do a film about Jesus and fruit. I'd love to see what you do with that idea.
Simultaneously, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, that is about all of the questions that I wrote down, and we have been going now for twice the length of the short. So that's usually what I try to shoot for in these interviews.
Awesome.
So thank you so much for your time, for this interview, for your excellent answers, and once again for submitting your short to this festival. Hospes is playing as in our official competition. I can say that our official competition in the animated category at the Academy of Death Racers Festival from January 5th to January 21st. Hopefully, as people are seeing this interview, they can go and watch it right now. And I hope that people will get a lot out of this, because it is a very, very excellent short, and I want more people to be able to see it. Thank you once again so much, Stephanie.
Thank you, Jeff. This has been like a really lovely conversation. Thank you so much.